Wow, it's been a long time since I've done one of these. Hello all out there in YouTube, and welcome to another episode of Horror Talk, the show that was on a bit of a hiatus for a little while, and hopefully will not be on a hiatus again. I do apologize for not doing an episode of this for a while. Things were very busy, and then everything kind of got away from me, but I've been wanting to do another one of these for a while, so here we are. And I apologize for not being in my typical location. I'm dog-sitting Axel here, who just had a major hump session with that panda in the background, so he's a little tired. Dear God. And Junie, of course. I'm at Axel and Junie's house right now, and here's Junie laying in the leaves. So, yes, we're finally doing another episode of Horror Talk, and last time I did a Horror Talk, I said that we were going to be doing a video on serial killer movies for my next Horror Talk. For those of you who are new to this channel, Horror Talk is a show that I like to do that's a little more relaxed, not as much research is done for this one. I just talk about a specific topic of horror off the top of my head, and I just give my fresh thoughts on a specific topic of horror. And obviously the topic of today's video is serial killer movies. When it comes to the movies that scare me the most, I've said many times on this channel that I'm terrified of water because I almost drowned when I was a kid, and I am terrified of serial killers. Serial killer movies tend to get under my skin more than any other movie, unless there's water involved. Because the concept of serial killers is such a frightening idea to me. It focuses on a concept that I just find so unsettling, and that is, you don't know what people are like when nobody's looking. You don't know what someone's like when they're in their house and no one else can see them. Most serial killers in real life, before we find out that they are serial killers, come across as normal people, at least to those on the outside of what's going on in their world. They look like normal people. Nobody knew that many of the famous serial killers in history were serial killers until they got caught. And that's just an idea that I find so frightening and fascinating in a way. So many people have a morbid fascination with serial killers. Not saying that we like serial killers, we don't, but it's just this intrigue with something that's so dark and disturbing that many of us are never going to understand. Everybody has this weird fascination with something dark and disturbing, whether it be cannibalism, serial killers, true crime, cults, various other things. And that's because so many of us would never dream, or at least I hope would never even think about doing something so terrible. And the curiosity comes from, what does it take for someone to cross that line into becoming not just a killer, but a serial killer, someone who's killed multiple people. And that's something I don't think we're ever going to really know in our lifetime. And I don't think it's going to be possible to ever truly find out what can really make someone become that twisted. So many psychologists say that they figured it out. So many people say it's nature versus nurture, but the fact of the matter is, sometimes people just snap. And that is scary, and it's something we don't like to think about. But it's happened many times. There are people who have been beaten down so much by something in their life or something, and then they just go nuts. There are people that seem to have nothing wrong with them, and then they just snap. Now, I am no expert on psychology. I'm not going to pretend that I know anything about the mind of a serial killer. I'm not going to pretend that I know anything about the mind of anybody. Hell, I barely know what's going on in my own head half the time. But, one of the things I always hear is people saying how fascinating it would be to get into the mind of a serial killer. And while serial killers are fascinating in a scary, disturbing kind of way, I don't think that going into the mind of a serial killer would be as interesting as people think. Because a lot of times, the reason a serial killer kills, it's because they're looking to just dominate someone. They're looking for a feeling of power over another human being, or they're trying to satisfy some kind of twisted sexual fantasy. I'm not saying that's the case with all serial killers, but I would say the majority of serial killers, that's what they're trying to get. They're either trying to get a sense of power over other people, or they're trying to satisfy some kind of sick sexual fantasy. You look at Ted Bundy, you look at the BTK killer, you look at John Wayne Gacy, you look at Jeffrey Dahmer, and many other serial killers. It's all about, again, fulfilling some kind of sexual desire or getting some kind of feeling of power over another human being. Not to say that serial killers aren't, again, fascinating in a dark way. Again, I want to make this very clear. You can be interested in serial killers and not like serial killers. But anyway, but again, the point is, it's just that if you were to get into the mind of a serial killer, I think the majority of what you would see is just a bunch of really twisted sexual fantasies. But that doesn't make the idea of serial killers, or serial killers in general, any less frightening, because these are twisted people who can blend in with society. I always say that some of the scariest scenes in serial killer movies are when we see the killer acting normal, hanging out with people, going out on dates. If they have friends, talking to their friends. A lot of times serial killers don't have friends, but there are also serial killers that do have friends and family. Like, John Wayne Gacy was married twice. Ted Bundy had a wife. That's the frightening concept to me, is, that they can interact with people, and those scenes in serial killer movies are so terrifying, where we see them being normal, just acting like normal everyday people, interacting with normal everyday people, but we know what they do when no one else is watching. So even during those slow moments when we see a serial killer living like a normal person, we're still on edge, because we know what they do behind closed doors. And the other thing that makes serial killers so frightening to me is how close to home they are. When it comes to horror, we never want to think that the horror is near us. We like to think that the horror is far away. And serial killers take the horror and bring it close to home. Because again, real-life serial killers. Jeffrey Dahmer lived in an apartment complex. John Wayne Gacy lived in suburbia. The BTK killer lived in suburbia. So, and you see that in a lot of serial killer movies, like Maniac. He's hunting people in New York City. Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer. He's hunting people in suburbia. Seven, Silence of the Lambs. All these serial killer movies, it takes horror and brings it close to home, and that just makes it all the more terrifying. There were two major events that really changed the landscape of horror cinema. Because real life always inspires art. Real life always inspires cinema. Whatever's happening in the world, it has an influence on the world of movies. And the two major events that really changed the landscape of horror cinema, the first one is the capture of Ed Gein. Now, Ed Gein wasn't really a serial killer. I mean, okay, he was a necrophiliac. He was a grave robber. He would take these bodies and make furniture out of these corpses. He would wear the skins of the corpses. But he was only convicted of one murder, and he only confessed to 2 murders. Now, because of the amount of bodies and body furniture that was in his house, we may never know how many people he really killed. But you look at it, he was only convicted of 1 murder and confessed to 2, so I don't know if that qualifies him as a serial killer, but that event the discovery of Ed Gein's House of Horrors. You know, his skin suits that he made, his furniture, the furniture that he made from other people's body parts. That left such an impact on the world, especially horror, because you look at what was happening in horror. You know, you had in the 30s you had more gothic horror like Dracula, Frankenstein. 40s you had more sort of monster mash-em-ups like Frankenstein versus the Wolfman and all these other ones. And then in the 50s, with the Cold War and everything going on, you had more sci-fi based horror and horror based around science. But then the whole Ed Gein incident happened, and people saw it. Again, it took horror and it brought it close to home, because most of the time during these time periods you had World War I, which was taking place in another country, you had World War II that was taking place in another country, and nobody wanted to think that the bad stuff was going to happen in America. And then Ed Gein, everybody in America knew what was happening in the Ed Gein case, and it brought horror close to home. And then you have real life influencing art and real life influencing film. You started seeing horror movies lean more towards that darker part, you know, more human-based killers. And then you had Psycho, which was, everybody knows, was heavily inspired by Ed Gein. And then that influenced everything as it went on. The second major event, and again, this isn't really a serial killer-based thing, but it led to more serial killer-based horror movies and more human-based horror movies, you know, more like a human-based villain in horror movies after it happened, the Manson murders. Because Ed Gein, even though it was something that really struck America, it was something that happened out in the country, so people could still have that false sense of security of, okay, that won't happen here in the city, that will happen far away in these, you know, way off in the country, it'll happen off the beaten path here in America. But then you had the Manson murders, where not only did it take place in the city, not only did it take place in suburbia, it happened to Sharon Tate, a Hollywood actress who was married to Roman Polanski, and that's a whole other thing there. But so now horror wasn't happening out in the country. Now horror was happening in the cities, even closer to what people consider civilization. And then that left another impact, and then boom, that changed horror even more. And then we went into the 70s, and you started seeing movies like Black Christmas, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Hills Have Eyes, I Drink Your Blood, and various other movies. And then you started seeing more slasher movies and more serial killer based horror movies. And of course, you have to distinguish the difference between a serial killer movie and a slasher movie, because there are a couple serial killer movies that have been, I guess you could say, indoctrinated into the slasher genre. And there are many slasher movies that people say, hey, does this count as a serial killer movie? The difference between a serial killer movie and a slasher movie, in my mind, is a serial killer movie is a little more grounded in reality. There are a lot of more exaggerated serial killer movies out there. I'm not going to pretend that that doesn't exist. But for the most part, a serial killer movie is somewhat more grounded in reality, whereas a slasher movie, everything's a little more exaggerated. It takes place in the world of a slasher film, you know, where, you know, if you have sex, you're going to get killed. You know, there's always sexy teenagers going someplace to party and die. There can be a supernatural angle to a slasher movie, you know, like Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, Halloween. Each one of those has some kind of supernatural edge to it. The killer in a slasher movie is treated a little more like a monster, like a movie monster, you know, like Michael Myers, he doesn't talk, he just walks and goes after you and kills you, and you can shoot him a bunch of times and he won't die. Freddy Krueger, he's burned, he has a gloved hand, he has claws for a weapon, and he goes after you in your dreams. Jason, he lumbers around, and in the later movies, he, like Michael Myers, he doesn't die, he keeps coming back from the dead, and then in the later movies, he becomes a little more zombie-like. Even in the slasher movies that aren't supernatural based, the killer is still treated like sort of a monster. You know, they're like My Bloody Valentine. You have the killer dressed as a miner, and he's still stalking around, and so even though you're dealing with a human character, it adds an inhuman element to them, like the fact that they don't talk and stuff like that. Whereas in a serial killer movie, again, it's a little more grounded in reality. The killer is, while seen as a monster, they're treated more like a person, an evil person, but whenever you finally get the killer has personality. The killer is a man or a woman in certain cases, or anything in between. It's grounded in reality. It's, you know, the rules of reality apply to the movie in a serial killer movie. But of course, like I said, you do have some crossover, like Maniac. Maniac is a serial killer movie, but it's also considered to be a slasher movie. So whatever rules I'm saying, you can take with a grain of salt. Now, when it comes to serial killer movies, you usually have two different categories. You have the one where it's more of a mystery thriller. There's a serial killer out there, and you have detectives, or you have somebody trying to find the killer. You don't really see the killer too much. You see crime scenes, you see people doing investigations. They talk about the killer. They're trying to get into the killer's mind, trying to discover the pattern of the killer so they can find him. And then you have the serial killer movies where you're following the killer, like Maniac and Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer. I know I've talked about Maniac and Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer a lot on this channel, and I'm probably going to talk about them a lot more in this video. I'll try not to, but just bear with me here. And then, when it comes to the category where we're following the killer, you have a subcategory of that where we're following a real-life serial killer. There are a lot of movies out there that are following an actual serial killer. Like Monster with Charlize Theron, the many movies we've gotten about Ted Bundy, the many movies we've gotten about Jeffrey Dahmer. There are all these various... and Zodiac, of course. Sorry to forget about Zodiac. But you have so many serial killer movies that follow a real-life serial killer. And there are some people that are okay with that, and there are some people who don't like that, because there are people out there that think we should remember the victims and not the killers, and there is truth to that. I mean, you know, these killers were horrible, horrible people, and it would be nice if we remembered the victims more, but I'm just as guilty about this as anybody. I don't know the names of a lot of their victims, and yeah, that's on me. I should know more about the victims. But anyway, going away from that, but again, there are a lot of movies that take inspiration from real-life serial killers. And honestly, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, because, like I said at the beginning, life inspires art all the time. And again, I want to make it clear, I don't think there's anything wrong with watching movies based on real events where people died and liking them. I'm just saying they can be harder to enjoy because we know what actually happened and that this situation actually happened. Again, he's not really a serial killer, but Ed Gein inspired so many horror movies. He inspired Texas Chainsaw Massacre, he inspired Psycho, and he inspired Silence of the Lambs to an extent. Many people give Ed Gein credit, for lack of a better word, for inspiring Silence of the Lambs. But the fact of the matter is, in Silence of the Lambs, when creating Buffalo Bill, they took inspiration from many different serial killers. Ed Gein was one of them, but they also took inspiration from Ted Bundy, because you remember that scene where Buffalo Bill is wearing a cast, and having trouble loading a chair onto his van, and he's using the cast to lure his victim in so he can get a better shot at him. Ted Bundy did that too. And then there's Gary Heidnik. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but this was another guy who inspired Buffalo Bill. This was a guy who kidnapped women and held them captive in a pit in his basement. So yes, while Ed Gein partially inspired Silence of the Lambs, they took inspiration from many different serial killers. Okay, so you have these two areas here. You have movies that are about real-life serial killers, and then you have movies that took inspiration from real-life serial killers. So you have, and then you have this Venn diagram where you have the real-life serial killer movies and the taking inspiration from serial killers for their movies. And then in the center, you have Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, which kind of fits in both categories. Let me make this clear. Henry in Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer is, for the most part, fictional. But he was heavily inspired by real-life killer Henry Lee Lucas. But it's weird. This is where it gets a little foggy, because Henry Lee Lucas was a serial killer who was arrested for murdering 2 people, just like Ed Gein. But then when he was in custody, he started confessing to more murders, and he started telling people that he killed all these people in all these different areas, because Henry Lee Lucas was a drifter, and he did drift around America and all that. So you had members of law enforcement bringing him the case files to various other cold cases, and then he would say, yes, I did that. And he confessed to many, many murders. And because of that, many officers were able to close all these unsolved murder cases. But then people started catching on to some fallacies in Henry Lee Lucas's story. He would confess to doing a murder in one area, and then he would confess to doing a murder in the other area, but then people realized, no, this can't happen, because he would have to be in 2 different states at the same time. So people found out that he was taking credit for all these different murders because he was getting recognition for that. You know, people were taking him out, they were, it's like, hey, I'll tell you more about this crime if I can get some, decent food other than this prison food and stuff like that. He was, in a way, being treated like a celebrity because people were able to close all these cold cases because he confessed to them. But then people started realizing that he made all of this up, so they had to reopen many of these cases. From what I understand, the only murders we know for certain that Henry committed were 2. We know for certain that he killed 2 people. Other than that, we don't know. And yeah, okay, there's a possibility that he could have murdered other people. But unfortunately, we're never going to know because he lied about committing so many other murders. Shocking. We can't trust a murderer. Sorry about that. Anyway, and that's where Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer comes in. Because, yes, it was inspired by the exaggerations of Henry Lee Lucas. I don't believe any of the victims, because we never hear any of the victims' names in Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, because I believe that everything was made up in Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. I believe, and I need to research this some more, so take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt, but I believe they were inspired by the exaggerations of Henry Lee Lucas and said, okay, let's make a horror movie about a guy named Henry who's a really horrible serial killer. So, yes, that exists in this weird gray area where Henry is inspired by a real-life serial killer, Henry Lee Lucas, but Henry Lee Lucas made up most of what he did. So the movie Henry made up its own story and then just called the killer Henry. So that's a weird one to involve with, because can you say, was it inspired by a real-life serial killer? Technically no, because the guy lied about committing all these murders, and every murder, I think every murder that took place in Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer was not taken from the Henry Lee Lucas case. I believe every one of these murders was fictional for the sake of the story. I think so. Don't hold me to that. Again, I have to look into this more. But that's what puts Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer on this other level. Because again, you had a real-life serial killer who lied so much about committing all these murders, and then you have this movie about a serial killer named Henry, and you have Michael Rooker as Henry in this movie, and I will say this, he gives one of the most frightening performances in any horror movie. I would say that he's scarier than Reagan from The Exorcist. I would say that he's scarier than I would say all of the big three, Freddy, Jason, and Michael. I saw in this interview with Michael Rooker once, he was asked, how did you get into the head of this character? And he said, I didn't get into the head of this character because I didn't care to get into the head of this character. This was a guy who was really sick and just, for lack of just pure evil in many ways, and he did not want to get into this killer's head. He just played the part, and he played it brilliantly. Henry, from Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, hands down one of the scariest characters in a horror movie. And then, of course, you have Maniac, which is one of my all-time favorite horror movies. And again, I'll try not to go on this for too long because I've talked about this many times on this channel, and I will probably talk about Maniac more on this channel. The character of Frank Zito is much like Henry Lee Lucas, one of the most terrifying characters in horror for me. He's one of my favorite horror movie characters. I like him more than the big three. And these two movies, Maniac and Henry, are just so damn frightening because we're spending so much time with the killers. The killers are the main characters. We're seeing what happens behind closed doors. Something that we wish we never knew. One of the more fascinating, entertaining, and wild serial killer movies that has ever come out is Natural Born Killers, directed by Oliver Stone and starring Woody Harrelson and Juliette Lewis. Natural Born Killers is a wild fucking movie, and it's so good, and it's a very interesting movie because we were talking about at the beginning of this video how people make movies about real-life serial killers and all that, and how there can be a sensationalism for serial killers in the media and in Hollywood and all that, and in a way that's what Natural Born Killers is all about, because you have these two killers who are going across country murdering people, just going on this killing spree, and you have the media sensationalizing their murders, and they develop a fan base. They have people who are rooting for them, essentially. And that is interesting commentary on what we were talking about at the beginning of this movie, how people can be fascinated with the serial killers, and we think about the killers more than we think about the victims. And the thing about Natural Born Killers is, it is categorized as more of a crime drama, but it's one of those movies that I would say has been adopted by the horror genre, because what other genre would really have it? But you watch Natural Born Killers, I would kind of put that in the same category as a movie like 2001 Space Odyssey, because it is more of an abstract, kind of an art house movie. 2001 Space Odyssey is an art house science fiction movie. Natural Born Killers is sort of an art house action, crime, thriller, serial killer flick. But it's just so damn good. It took me a while to see Natural Born Killers, but ever since I saw Natural Born Killers, I loved it. Oh my god, that's such a wild ride. Then you have the other end of it, where you have serial killer movies that are based more on the detective side of things, the investigation side of things. We're following the detectives and the police officers trying to find the killer. And of course you have Silence of the Lambs in that category, you have Seven in that category. Those are the two most notorious ones. And while Maniac is my favorite serial killer movie, Hannibal Lecter is my favorite character. Ever. He's my favorite character of all time. I just find him so fascinating. Now, the disturbing thing about these movies is you're watching the detectives search for the killer, and you're seeing the toll that the investigation is taking on them. Like with Silence of the Lambs, you have Clarice Starling, who is my second favorite character of all time. Hannibal Lecter is my favorite villain. Clarice Starling is my favorite protagonist. You know that she's dealing with psychological issues, and she is legitimately afraid while she's going through this investigation. There's that scene where she's talking into that recorder during the autopsy of one of the victims, and you hear her voice shaking. And then, of course, we find out that because of a trauma she experienced in her past, that's why she is putting so much energy into finding Catherine Martin, who has been kidnapped by Buffalo Bill. And that's the interesting thing about these more investigative serial killer movies, is we're less following the killer and we're seeing how the serial killer's mind and his psychology and his murders are affecting the detectives. You see that in Seven. It's beautifully done in Seven. It's perfectly done in Seven, because you have Detective Somerset, played by Morgan Freeman, who wants to retire, but he's been drawn into this case, and then you see Brad Pitt's character, Detective Mills, getting angrier and angrier at the fact that they can't find this guy, and he's one step ahead of them the entire time. And then we have the infamous ending of Seven, which I won't spoil here, but that's the ultimate way that... The ending of Seven is the ultimate breaking of a detective who's on the hunt for a serial killer. That's all I will say to that. But there's one more detective investigation-based serial killer movie that does not get nearly enough credit, and that is Cruising. Cruising is another one of those movies where people debate on whether it's a horror movie or not a horror movie, and that's another movie that I say has been adopted by the horror genre, because what other genre would have it? What I am about to say about Cruising, I take no credit for, because a lot of these ideas came from a video I watched on one of my favorite YouTube channels, Mr. Parka. He's one of my favorite YouTube channels, and he did this video where he talked with someone about Cruising, and they revealed so many interesting ideas about Cruising that made me love the movie even more. Because in Cruising, the movie takes place in New York City, and the backdrop of the murders are the gay BDSM leather bars of New York City. Not necessarily the gay community, but the subculture of the gay community that engages in these BDSM activity underground. And that's the backdrop for a murder mystery. You have this serial killer going around killing gay men. And the interesting thing is, when Cruising came out, you had gay people protesting the movie because they thought it was anti-gay, and then you had gay people praising the movie because they said, hey, this is finally a movie for us. So you have one side saying it was anti-gay, the other side saying it was pro-gay. When you watch the movie, they're both wrong. The movie is not telling you whether it's okay to be gay or it's not okay to be gay. It's not taking one side or the other. It's just using this, not even the gay community, it's using this subculture of the gay community, the underground BDSM community, as a backdrop for a murder mystery. And there's BDSM in the straight community as well, but anyway, just looking at it like that, there's so many interesting ways you can look at this movie, because, again, like I heard from that video on Mr. Parker's channel, the killer in Cruising is more of a concept than an actual person. And dealing with who the killer is, to this day, you can look at it straightforward where you know who the killer is, or you can look at it in a way that you don't know who the killer is. You see how damaged Al Pacino is, because Al Pacino's character in this movie, he's a cop who is sent to go undercover in the leather bars to try and find this killer. And you can already tell before he went into this, he already wasn't right in the head, and this case is taking more of a toll on him as he's trying to find this killer. It gets to the point where you don't know if Al Pacino is on the up and up throughout this story. I don't want to give more away than that, but this is Cruising is a movie that I highly recommend people watch. It is a very dirty movie, and it does deal with some subject matter that you haven't seen in too many other movies that came out in the 80s, and I really respect it for that. And, you know, while I can't really speak on behalf of the gay community because I am a straight guy, I respect the fact that William Friedkin, when he was trying to make this movie, he went to the leather bars. He went to people who were part of the BDSM gay community to use them sort of as advisors and learn as much about this community as he could, and he used members of these sub-communities as background actors in his movie. So I respect the fact that he's like, okay, when he was doing this, he tried to educate himself as much as possible on the subject matter, and he went to members of that community so he could be as accurate as he could with portraying this community. But Cruising is a fantastic serial killer movie, and it is uncomfortable, and I would put it up there with Silence of the Lambs and Seven when it comes to the detective-style serial killer movies. And on that note, I think I've rambled on for long enough about this particular subject matter. I could probably go on for even longer about serial killer movies because they scare me so much. We've only scratched the surface of certain serial killer movies. I've only talked about a handful of them, but there are a lot of really unsettling serial killer movies out there. Some that are based on actual serial killers, some that are based on fictional serial killers. But the fact of the matter is, serial killers are one of the most frightening aspects of our society. Just the thought of someone who can go out there and kill multiple people, it's frightening to us. And the reason it's so frightening is because you don't know who's a serial killer and who's not. You could have passed someone on the streets every day, waved to them every morning, and then find out they're a serial killer. Again, that frightening concept of the fact that we don't know what people are like behind closed doors. Serial killers, we're always going to have a morbid fascination with serial killers, and we're always going to be afraid of them. Serial killer movies, hands down, the scariest subgenre for me. I love serial killer movies because they terrify me so much. And on that note, I hope you enjoyed this little episode of Horror Talk. I will try to do more of these in the future because I do love this series, and you clearly like this series as well. Forgive me for not being in my typical location. I have a lot of dog sitting coming up. There's going to be a long stint where I'm not at my house, but I will try to make more videos in front of my collection. But if I make a video and I'm in a different location, don't be surprised by that. But on that note, thank you all for watching. What are some of your favorite serial killer movies? Let me know your favorite serial killer movie that follows the killer, and let me know your favorite detective investigation style serial killer movie. And while you're at it, what other topics would you like me to cover for Horror Talk? But on that note, thank you all so much for watching. Thank you to all those who have watched, who have subscribed, who have continued to support this channel. I greatly appreciate it. We're almost at 1 million views on this channel, so I don't like asking this too much, but if you could spread the video around so that we can get to 1 million views, that would be great. But you don't have to do that if you don't want to. I just appreciate the fact that you all continue to watch and support this channel. Thank you all so much. And until next time, this is the Maniac here to remind you that the Grindhouse will never die.